Israel has begun tactical pauses in Gaza, allowing some vital aid to make its way into the Strip. But it comes after 2 months of heavily restricted aid, which itself followed more than 2 months of total blockade. It's left Palestinians fighting for food. On this week's Foresight, we'll explain how Israel's handling of aid since the very beginning of this conflict, and especially during a few disastrous months this year, has led to this point. A population on the brink of famine, international outrage, and accusations of starvation being used as a weapon of war. This is how a crisis for the people of Gaza may have created a watershed in international opinion, leaving Israel more isolated and under mounting pressure. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is man-made, rooted in decisions about territory, security, trucks, and access points. The consequences snaking through a whole society, breaking it down, placing individuals in the unrelenting grip of hunger. Let's start by looking at the most recent decision. Under mounting pressure, Israel has declared tactical pauses in its military operations. Nearly 90% of the Strip was already under evacuation orders or within Israeli militarized zones, according to the UN, leaving more than 2 million people confined to just 12% of the land. But now, in 3 areas, Gaza City, Deir al-Balah and al-Mawasi, Israel says it will suspend military activity for 10 hours each day, between 10 a.m. and 8 p.m. until further notice. It's also promising humanitarian corridors for aid distribution for the main access points, again daily, from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. Israel's Prime Minister is trying to tread the line between domestic and international pressure. To an Israeli audience, he gave one message.
נצטרך להמשיך לאפשר כניסה של אספקה הומניטרית מינימלית. עשינו את זה עד עכשיו.
A day later, in an English-language statement, he made a very different announcement. However Netanyahu describes this aid effort, the UN's emergency relief head has called current levels a drop in an ocean of need, given how far and how fast things in Gaza have deteriorated in recent weeks. We spoke to Rachel Cummings from Save the Children, who's in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza.
There have been some humanitarian supplies being able to enter into Gaza in the last few days, but the scale of the need across every person, the whole of Gaza, is extraordinary.
Now, the foundations of this humanitarian disaster were laid right at the beginning of this war. We're going to look at the amount of aid Israel has allowed into Gaza since October 2023. But before we do, we want to be clear about the data. We're using figures supplied by the Israeli military, and analysis by our fact-check team has shown that Israel's numbers are consistently higher than the UN's, leading to public disputes over accuracy. But even according to Israel's own data, the amount of aid being allowed into Gaza falls well short of what Palestinians need. The UN says that at least 3,500 trucks of aid are required every week to feed and medically support the population of more than 2 million people. Israel's data show the first aid trucks entering Gaza 2 weeks after the October 7th attacks back in 2023. From that point on, amid near constant fighting in Gaza, and until a ceasefire came into effect on the 19th of January 2025, Israel reports a total of around 66,000 aid trucks entering the Strip. That averages out at about 1,000 trucks of aid per week, meaning for the 15 months from the beginning of the war, Gaza received little more than a quarter of the aid the UN says it needed. During the 6-week ceasefire, there was a boost in aid supply. Israel allowed in enough aid to hit the UN target, providing crucial support for a population suffering more than a year of conflict and shortages. But the World Food Programme warned that a collapse of the ceasefire would mean the risk of starvation returning. In fact, what happened was worse. A pivotal decision, instrumental to the crisis now playing out in Gaza. Not only did Israel pull out of the ceasefire at the beginning of March, it announced a total blockade. For 78 days, no trucks, no food, no medicine, no fuel entered Gaza. It had been threatened since the start of the war. 2 days after the Hamas attacks of October 7th, Israel's then Defense Minister Yoav Gallant told the world he'd ordered a complete siege on the Strip. That didn't last. But 18 months later, his replacement, Israel Katz, said what was now a full blockade of aid to Gaza's population was one of the main pressure levers against Hamas. The blockade may have pleased far-right members of Israel's governing coalition, but it set in motion a rapidly worsening chain of events inside Gaza, prompting the hoarding of food and huge price inflation, then spreading hunger. As the international pressure was growing on Israel, Netanyahu made a second pivotal decision on aid. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, backed by the US and Israel, was, Israel said, designed to provide aid directly to those in need in an orderly, dignified way, bypassing Hamas, which it accuses of stealing and profiting from the old aid system. But aid agencies predicted disaster. Even before the program started, the privately run company's CEO quit following widespread criticism of the plan. GHF established 4 aid distribution centers compared to the 400 the UN were operating, 3 in the far south and 1 in the center of Gaza, located deep in militarized zones guarded by private security, reachable only by those strong enough to travel, often many miles, through an active war zone. Those making the journey then forced to queue along designated routes, massing in their thousands, all under the watch of Israel's military. The result? Chaos and violence. Videos showed desperate, unarmed Palestinians under fire as they approached the sites to collect aid. Israel at first blamed Hamas, then said it had used live fire near civilians when its troops were deemed under threat. The Israeli army says investigations into those incidents continue and that claims its troops deliberately fire at civilians are entirely false and unfounded. But a former US Green Beret who is working for GHF in Gaza gave a very different account to a US senator this week.
What I saw on numerous occasions are the Israeli Defense Forces firing into the crowds of the Palestinians, firing over their head, firing at their feet, firing into the crowd.
Since GHF began operating on May the 26th, more than 750 Palestinians have been killed in the vicinity of their distribution centers. When aid is handed out at the sites themselves, it's competition rather than distribution. Scenes like this help explain why international agencies say aid should be delivered directly to the people who need it, not for those people to come to the aid.
The expectation is that people walk in the baking sun for hours to go to these GHF sites. They have no structure around opening times. People are then herded into pens and then released to scramble for whatever they can find. And it's desperate. People are literally risking their lives for potentially nothing.
GHF says it's delivered 97 million meals in the 2 months it's been operating. Those calculations have been questioned, but even at face value, across Gaza's population, that would mean about 3/4 of a meal per person per day. Distribution is wildly uneven, based on location and ability to get to the sites. Plenty ends up being sold for huge sums in Gaza's markets. The most vulnerable, the poorest, the weakest, those who most need the aid, are the least likely to get it. After 78 days of no aid getting in, between the 18th of May, when Israel announced the end of the blockade, until July the 23rd, just 492 trucks of aid were crossing into Gaza every week on average. This week, the cumulative consequences of all of this, months of aid shortages, total blockade, and a chaotic and deadly new distribution system became clearer. UN agencies saying nearly 2/5 of Gaza's people are going days without eating, that 500,000 are now experiencing famine-like conditions, and that in Gaza City, acute malnutrition among children under 5 has quadrupled in 2 months to 16,500.
We have children coming into our clinic who 2 weeks ago were started on a treatment program because they were moderately malnourished. They have moderate acute malnutrition, and now they're coming back with severe acute malnutrition. And we know next week, unfortunately, they will come back with severe acute malnutrition and complications. And that is completely the wrong trajectory for a child to be on when they are receiving treatment in a clinic for malnutrition. So is the 100 aid trucks enough? No, absolutely not enough.
Before it announced its tactical pauses, Israel was blaming UN agencies for failing to pick up hundreds of trucks worth of aid in depots on the Gaza side of crossings from Israel. The UN said Israel was failing to grant permissions and ensure safe passage. The number of trucks getting out of those depots is now rising, 109 on July the 29th, but most are stopped and looted almost immediately by desperate individuals who watch them go in and wait for them to come out again. Others are hijacked by organized armed gangs. Aid workers talk of frightened drivers and the need for alternative routes and faster Israeli military approvals for the trucks to have any chance of getting to aid warehouses, bakeries and soup kitchens. Israel has allowed airdrops into Gaza once again, but aid agencies point out that they are imprecise, sometimes dangerous, and barely make a dent in the sheer volume of aid that Gaza now needs. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention, it is the occupying power that has the duty, quote, to the fullest extent of the means available to ensure food and medical supplies for civilians.
Please be seated.
In April, South Africa accused Israel at the International Court of Justice of using starvation as a weapon of war. Israel denied it then and continues to do so.
Israel is presented as though we are applying a campaign of starvation in Gaza. What a bold-faced lie. There is no policy of starvation in Gaza, and there is no starvation in Gaza.
Aid agencies say that only a full ceasefire will enable the flood of aid now required to feed those most at risk, to restore faith in the aid system, and in turn, bring food prices down. The Israeli Prime Minister says, as he has done throughout this conflict, that Hamas is exploiting food shortages and that it, not Israel, is responsible for the stalled ceasefire talks. The UN has long disputed Israeli claims that Hamas steals aid on a large scale. This month, there were reports that neither the Israeli military nor US aid officials have found any evidence of systemic theft. And international pressure is ratcheting up. Britain, like France before it, is promising to recognize the state of Palestine in September unless Israel reaches a ceasefire and commits to a two-state solution. Even Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu's most reliable ally, is questioning Israel's war in Gaza.
Some of those kids that's real starvation stuff. I see it, and you can't fake that.
Back home, a different set of demands, with reports that some of Netanyahu's cabinet members want an even more extensive occupation, threatening step-by-step annexation of Gaza to pressure Hamas into a ceasefire. All while calls for Netanyahu to agree an end to the war and free Israeli hostages grow louder. Netanyahu says Israel continues to work for a deal despite having withdrawn its negotiators, but is being blocked by Hamas's obstinacy. Mediators Egypt and Qatar have also blamed Hamas for the breakdown and this week signed up with Saudi Arabia to an international call for Hamas to disarm and cede power. Hamas has been insisting on an end to the GHF system and wants assurances over a permanent end to the war before it agrees to a ceasefire deal.
Allahu Akbar.
In Gaza, civilians desperate for a ceasefire curse Hamas as well as Israel as they contend with deepening hunger and constant threat of Israeli bombs. Gaza's health ministry says more than 60,000 people have now been killed in the course of the war. Gaza's many times displaced, traumatized population exists among ruins with a devastated economy reliant on health and education systems that can barely operate. But for all of that, what's come to dominate daily life in recent weeks for so many is sheer hunger, a fundamental struggle to survive. Well, joining us now to discuss all this in greater depth, in particular what it means for Israeli decision-making going forward, is the former Israeli diplomat, former foreign policy advisor to former Israeli governments, Alon Pinkas. Mr. Pinkas, thank you very much for joining us. We've been hearing from Benjamin Netanyahu this week that he says there is no starvation inside Gaza. He says there are food shortages, but blames those on the UN and blames Hamas for exploiting them. That doesn't seem to have got much traction for him internationally. What about domestically inside Israel? Are people watching these images, seeing this reporting? I mean, what is the position there?
On the one hand, people do not believe what Netanyahu is saying. I mean, they take his mendaciousness as a fact of life, and they just assume that he's either spinning or flat out lying. On the other hand, and this goes back to October 2023, when Hamas launched the terror attack. Israelis have been somewhat oblivious, indifferent, and willingly ignorant of what's going on in Gaza. But there is a third dimension to this. In the last 2 or 3 weeks, with the reports of starvation, famine, borderline famine coming out of Gaza, and those horrid pictures all over the place, there was no way for Israelis to hide from those, from that footage, or from that information. So they became more immersed in it. It hasn't been reflected yet in public opinion, but as for Netanyahu, no one takes him seriously, and no one believes him when he stands up and says there's no starvation in Gaza. That's nonsense.
For many months now, since last year, we've heard sort of rumblings from inside the IDF questioning the purpose of continuing this war. Recently, we've heard from former Israeli intelligence officials, military intelligence officials saying, this is a total disaster, both in terms of what's happening inside Gaza and what it's doing to Israel's status, standing internationally. I mean, is there a real kind of crunch point coming up in terms of, does Israel really press on in this way?
Yeah, there has to be. And it's important distinction that you made by pointing to the fact that these accusations or this criticism or these reservations are being made from within the IDF, within the Israel Defense Forces, rather than from within the government. You've heard no opposition force, voice, from within the cabinet. You've heard no dissenting views coming out of the government. These reservations are coming only from the military, which is asking, as is the public, by the way, and that is reflected in consistent polls, that people don't understand what the war is about anymore. People don't understand what the objectives are. People don't understand what are attainable goals. People don't understand what exactly it is that Israel wants to achieve, and is there an end game, an exit strategy, a post-war Gaza? These are all euphemisms for an absence of a strategy. But in terms of the military that you pointed to, they have been asking some very tough questions, and when unanswered, they found ways to leak them and make them into public knowledge. And
so what next? I mean, Netanyahu is obviously still focused on maintaining his position. He is, at the very least, influenced by these far-right ministers who want nothing short of a full reoccupation and annexation and Israeli settlement. Where does that leave him?
Well, to begin with, and I don't want to turn this into a political discussion, I question the distinction that is constantly being made between Mr. Netanyahu and his extreme right-wing coalition. He is the extreme right-wing coalition. He is them, and they are him. He chose them. He appointed him. He's empowering them. He has never said anything to negate or condemn or clarify the things that they've been saying about flattening Gaza, or expelling all the Palestinians. So in terms of his position, there are two ways of looking at it. For a very long time, he's been relishing his position. The world is against us, and I'm the only one who stands up for Israel's true interests. And we have taken, and we still stand still on the moral high ground, and no one's going to okay, fine. But on the other hand, in the last 2 weeks, particularly with the statement made by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and then Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, following the statement made by French President Emmanuel Macron on recognizing a Palestinian state, however declarative that is, however symbolic that is, it did change something in the calculus of the Israeli government. You see by the quickness, the swiftness, rather, of their reactions, the anger that they understand that they're being not only isolated, but condemned broadly.
Do you think that something decisive has shifted in terms of Israel's international standing, its diplomatic power?
I don't want to delve into socio-political studies that will be done in a few months or a few years. but there's a case to be made that there's a generational change taking. If you look at polls in America, in Europe, by respectable and reputable polling companies like Pew Research, Gallup International, Analytics, and so on, you see that there is a dramatic change in how the world views Israel. So the point that I alluded to earlier, in which Netanyahu says, "Oh, I don't care about this. It's me against the world," and thinks this would do him, this would benefit him and do him good in terms of his political base. Those days are over, because we're looking at wall-to-wall condemnations and wall-to-wall criticism of Israel, and Israelis are beginning to feel that.
And yet,
again,
and yet the messaging coming out of the Netanyahu cabinet is talk of punitive, piece-by-piece annexation.
that's exactly what Hamas wants. This would absolve Hamas of the savage acts of terror that they committed by saying, look, this is what the Israelis planned all along. We're resisting Israeli occupation. There's no one, there are 8 billion people on this planet. There's no one in the world who's going to buy into Israeli annexation of Gaza. This government seems to be so detached from reality that they don't see that what they're threatening to do is actually self-injurious.
And interestingly, there was an op-ed from a former Israeli military foreign spokesman in the last couple of days saying this is precisely the moment when some of the Arab world is peeling away from at least Hamas and demanding that it disarm and get out of power in Gaza. This is the time for Israel to try and promote its own interests in arguing for a two-state solution, being at the table for that process, and getting a better result, a Hamas-free Palestinian state in some future point. But presumably, that's nothing that this particular administration is ever likely to sign up to.
Well, you just answered your own question. That is exactly right. I mean, there was a dramatic event that took place, on Wednesday in New York, in which 22 Arab League countries joined 28 European Union countries and an additional 19 other countries, and all said recognition of Israel is a must. A two-state solution to be negotiated is desirable. Hamas should be disarmed and effectively removed. 10 years ago, Israel would have endorsed this enthusiastically. 20 years ago, it would have sounded like a dream. And now all you see from the Israeli government is this, offhanded dismissal. Oh, well, they're not serious. They don't mean that. That is exactly what Israel should be doing right now. But like I said, you answered your own question, not this government.
What prospect for getting the requisite amount of aid into Gaza? Israel saying it's the UN's fault, the UN saying we can't bring stuff to our depots because of the interceptions by these desperate people or indeed criminal gangs en route. Are there any options that you can see to meeting the very acute need currently in Gaza?
There are only two options, and none of which is very promising or very cheerful. The first is occupy the entire Gaza Strip and make sure that all humanitarian goes in. But if you occupy the Gaza Strip, you own the Gaza Strip, and that means taking care of everything, which is something that Israel doesn't want to do, but is not saying that it doesn't want to do because supposedly those annexationist tendencies and trends within the government. The second option would be to outsource the entire humanitarian aid, and that includes both potable water, food, and medical supplies, meaning that not Israel will conduct this, no outsourcing of an Israeli-controlled company that would do that, which is the case now, which essentially means giving it back to the UN, which Israel doesn't want to do. So I'm not very optimistic about the chances there, barring a ceasefire, that is.
All right, bracing final thoughts. Thank you very much, Alon Pinkas. We appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.